Hey, before we jump into the story, could you do me a huge favor and drop a quick hi in the comments? It sounds like a small thing, but it seriously helps YouTube get this out to more sci-fi lovers just like us. I always love to see who's tuning in. Richard Richmond plastered his back against the cold stone, forcing himself not to breathe. The cave was a joke, maybe 10 feet deep, barely enough space to hide one person, let alone offer any real protection. Somewhere in the pitch black behind him, water dripped with a steady beat that echoed the frantic pounding in his chest. And outside, the jungle was screaming. Bugs the size of a man's fist clicked and whirred in the canopy. Creatures that sounded like birds but definitely weren't, shrieked warnings to each other. And something big, something heavy enough to snap branches as thick as his arm, was crashing through the undergrowth. And somewhere in that chaos were the hunters. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, trying to get his racing heart under control. He was 19 years old, had been for exactly 3 weeks. He'd celebrated his birthday on the transport ship, somewhere between the main colony and this absolute hell. Marco had managed to find a forgotten nutrition bar and stuck a piece of wire in it, pretending it was a candle. They'd actually laughed about it. But Marco was gone now. Rachel was too. Claude, Danny, every single one of them, gone. Richard forced his eyes open, staring at the jungle framed by the mouth of the cave. It was a nightmare of green, black, and a sickening red where volcanic vents steamed, bleeding heat into the air. The humidity was a physical thing, pressing down on his skin, making every single breath feel like he was slowly drowning. His mind flashed to Rachel. She was the first to go. All 5 of them had landed together, tossed out of the transport pod like a bag of trash. No gear, no weapons, not even an explanation, just the clothes on their backs and the sheer terror in their eyes. Rachel had tried to be the calm one. Back on Earth, she was pre-med, always logical, the one who insisted everything was going to be okay. She took exactly 3 steps into the jungle before a spear made of pure light punched right through her. Richard never even saw where it came from. 1 second, Rachel was there, pushing a giant leaf out of her way. The next, a gaping, cauterized hole the size of a fist was burning in her chest, and she was just falling. She didn't even make a sound. She just collapsed like a puppet whose strings had been cut. And then the hunters laughed. Richard had heard them, hidden somewhere high up in the dense canopy. It was a sick, barking sound, like dogs choking on broken glass. A moment later, a voice mangled by some translation device crackled through the air. First kill, the female, disappointing, no challenge. It was in that exact moment that Richard understood. This wasn't some kidnapping for ransom. This was a game. This was their entertainment. They ran after that. Marco took the lead because that's what Marco always did. Claude covered their 6 because he was the biggest, the strongest, the guy who'd been a defensive lineman back in college. Danny was in the middle, sobbing but still running, too terrified to even think about stopping. And Richard? He just followed, completely numb, watching one foot fall in front of the other, because he knew if he let himself think about Rachel, about her body lying in the mud back there, he would stop moving. And stopping meant you were next. Claude made it until day 2. They'd stumbled upon a stream and decided to follow it, praying it would lead them to a settlement, a research outpost, anything. The jungle had actually started to thin out a bit, and for a few hours Richard let a tiny sliver of hope creep in. Maybe, just maybe they were going to make it. Then Claude just vanished. 1 second he was right behind them, his huge frame crashing through the brush. The next, the ground just swallowed him whole. He was gone. It was a pit, maybe 20 feet deep, expertly hidden under a layer of branches and leaves. A trap. Richard crawled to the edge and peered down. He immediately wished he hadn't. The thing at the bottom of the pit wasn't an animal, not like any animal Richard had ever seen. It was just a writhing mass of claws and teeth and pure hunger. Its pale skin rippled in the darkness, and Claude was screaming. Screaming in a way Richard didn't know a human being could scream. And then just as suddenly, the screaming stopped. The hunters laughed again. One of them appeared on a branch right above the pit, calmly recording the whole thing with a little floating drone. It was tall and thin with skin like grayish-brown leather. It had 4 fingers on each hand, and its eyes glowed faintly, seeing the world in heat signatures instead of light. The large one, the translator buzzed. Better. A good fight. Marco and Danny died on the 3rd day. They had tried to set up an ambush. It was Marco's idea. Find a narrow pass, use rocks, branches, anything to fight back. It was a stupid plan. Richard knew it was stupid from the start, but Marco had to do something, and doing anything felt better than just waiting to be picked off. The hunters walked right into their trap like it was a complete joke, which to them it was. A weighted net made of some strange mesh dropped from the trees, landing on Marco and Danny at the same time. It instantly contracted the moment it hit, pinning them helplessly to the ground. Richard was hidden behind a massive fallen log, completely frozen, as 4 of the hunters stepped out of the jungle like ghosts. They didn't kill them right away. They took their time, circling them, prodding them with the tips of their spears. One of them was narrating into the translator while another one steered the camera drone. 2 more remaining. The male is resisting, entertaining. The smaller one is hiding. We will let him watch. It builds the suspense. And Richard had watched. He wanted so badly to help, to scream, to run out there and do something, anything at all. But his body refused to obey. Some primal, ancient part of his brain had taken over, locking his muscles, keeping him hidden, keeping him alive. He watched them kill Marco and Danny, and he did absolutely nothing. That was 2 days ago. And now Richard was all alone in a tiny cave, listening to the screams of the jungle, knowing the hunters were out there, knowing their cameras were still watching, and knowing that on dozens of worlds across the galaxy, millions of aliens were probably placing bets on how long he would last. He had to get out of there. Staying put was just a slower way to die. The cave offered no food, no water, and 0 protection from the things that came out at night. He'd seen them the night before, slinking through the shadows on far too many legs, clicking and chittering to each other in a language made of pure hunger. The hunters didn't even have to lift a finger. They could just sit back and wait for the planet to finish him off. Richard forced himself onto his feet. His legs were trembling. After 3 days of non-stop running and hiding on an empty stomach, his muscles were seizing up. The edges of his vision were starting to blur. That suffocating humidity was a constant weight, and every breath he took tasted of sulfur from the nearby volcanic vents. He stared out at the jungle, a blur of green, black, and angry red. He took a step out of the cave. The wave of heat was instant. The temperature had been climbing all morning, turning the jungle from simply miserable to actively trying to kill him. Steam hissed from the ground where geothermal vents cracked the soil. High above, the canopy filtered the light of the alien sun into a sickly yellowish-green haze. Richard just picked a direction and started walking. He didn't run. He'd learned that lesson. Running just got them excited, made them close in faster. Walking was smarter. It let him watch where he was stepping, look out for more traps, and save what little energy he had left. Not that it really mattered. He already knew how this was going to end. The hunters found him an hour later. He'd managed to cover maybe 2 kilometers, sticking to a ridge where the trees seemed a little less dense. His throat was on fire from thirst. His feet were a mess of blisters, bleeding inside his worn-out shoes. Every few minutes, his vision would just fade to gray, and he'd have to stop and lean against a tree, waiting for the world to come back into focus. The barking laugh echoed from up above. Richard looked up, and there they were, 4 of them, perched in the canopy, forming a loose half-circle around him, grayish-brown skin, eyes glowing with his own body heat. The camera drone floated silently between them, its lens zoomed in tight on his face. "The final one," the translated voice declared. 4 days of survival, acceptable entertainment. The hunt is now over. In that moment, something inside Richard just snapped. It wasn't his courage. That had been obliterated days ago. It was something else. It was the last wall he'd built in his mind to shield himself from what was really happening. As it crumbled, he was suddenly running. Not toward safety, there was no such thing here. He was just running because his body refused to stand still and let them kill him. The hunters let him go. He could hear them following him at a casual pace, tracking him effortlessly through the jungle as if they had all the time in the universe. Because they did. This was the grand finale, the big climax. This was the part the viewers paid extra to see. Richard crashed through a wall of thick leaves and then skidded to a halt. He was at the edge of a cliff. 100 feet of nothing, and then a jumble of jagged rocks below, with a river of black, bubbling water churning between them. The other side was maybe 200 meters away, another sheer wall of jungle disappearing into the haze. There was no bridge, no vine, no way across. Richard spun around. The hunters were emerging from the tree line right behind him. They weren't even rushing. They fanned out slowly, blocking any chance of escape, holding their light spears casually by their sides. The leader, the one with the translator, took a step forward. "End of the road, human. You ran well. Better than most of your species, but all prey runs out of room eventually." Richard's chest was heaving. The world was swimming in his vision. His legs felt like they were made of jelly. "Why?" The word escaped his lips as a dry, cracked whisper. "Why are you doing this?" The hunter tilted its head, and the translator crackled to life. "Entertainment. Your species is new to the galaxy. You are soft, weak. You make for excellent prey. And the viewers, they pay very well to watch soft things struggle." The camera drone floated up until it was inches from Richard's face. "Any final words, human? The audience always appreciates a little drama." Richard's mind drifted. He thought of his father, Samuel Richmond, a former army man who'd spent the last 15 years as a hunting guide up in Alaska. a quiet man who seemed more comfortable talking to the wilderness than to other people. Richard's parents had divorced when he was 12, but it never changed a thing between him and his dad. Every single summer, Richard would fly up to Alaska. They would sit on the porch of their cabin for hours talking about everything and nothing at all. He remembered his dad cooking elk steaks over a crackling fire, telling wild stories about the mountains. Richard was never much of a hunter himself, but he cherished those trips, the deep silence of the woods, the way his father transformed into someone simpler, someone whole, when the noise of the world faded away. He'd even bought a plane ticket to go see him again after this was all over. "My father," Richard said, his voice finding a sliver of strength. "My father will find you." The alien hunter let out a short, barking laugh. "Your father is light years away, little human. He'll never know what happened to you. He'll never find this place. He'll just live out his sad, short life on his tiny planet, always wondering why his boy never came home." The hunter raised a spear, humming with light. "Goodbye, human!" The very last thing Richard Richmond ever saw was a flash of energy, brilliant, white, and final. And then there was only darkness. Miles and galaxies away, in a small cabin outside Fairbanks, Alaska, Samuel Richmond watched it all happen. He was watching on an old 20-inch screen with a crack in the corner, propped up on a wooden table he'd built with his own 2 hands. The only light in the cabin came from the flickering video, casting long shadows that pooled in the corners of the room. On the screen, a young man stood on the edge of a cliff. Samuel's hands were on his knees, perfectly still. His breath was slow and steady, just like it was when he was tracking a bear through the wilderness. Patient, silent, and completely in control. The young man on the screen was talking to someone just out of frame, but Samuel couldn't make out the words. The audio was a garbled mess, drowned out by an alien voice that his translator software turned into the hyped-up chatter of a sportscaster. "The final prey is nearing its end. What a fantastic 4 days of entertainment. Our hunters have been magnificent, folks. Get ready for the thrilling climax." Samuel's jaw tightened. Just then, the camera angle changed, and he saw the hunters for the first time. They were tall, skinny creatures with mottled gray skin and eyes that glittered unnaturally in the alien sun. They moved with the lazy confidence of true predators, spreading out to cut off any chance of escape. Samuel watched the young man turn to face them, and a cold, heavy weight settled deep in his gut. He knew that face. He knew the way that young man squared his shoulders when he was terrified but refused to show it. He knew the slight tilt of his chin, a stubborn habit he got from his mother. He knew the exact shade of brown in his hair, darker than his own, and the way it flopped over his forehead when he'd waited too long for a haircut. "Richard," Samuel whispered. His hands clenched into tight fists. On the screen, his son was talking again. The translator picked up a few words. "My father will find you." The alien hunter just laughed, said something back, and raised its weapon. Samuel didn't even blink. There was a flash of light. The body dropped. The hunters struck a pose over their prize as a camera drone buzzed around them, getting all the best angles for the highlight reel. The broadcast kept rolling for another 3 minutes. Stats scrolled across the screen. Survival time, distance covered, viewer engagement. The hunters gave a post-game interview, laughing about their favorite parts of the chase. Samuel watched every second. When the screen finally went black, he just sat there in the silence, listening to the slow, steady thump of his own heart. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't punch a hole in the wall or fall to his knees or do any of the things a father is supposed to do when he watches his only child get murdered for sport. Samuel Richmond sat in the dark and felt something inside him wake up. Something that had been sleeping for 20 years, buried under a quiet life and tourist guiding gigs in the Alaskan wilderness. It was something from before, something from the army. He got to his feet, slow and deliberate, and walked to the window. He looked out at the endless, snow-covered forest that stretched all the way to the mountains. Richard's last words echoed in his mind. "My father will find you." Samuel's own reflection stared back from the dark glass, his eyes looking flat and empty like the eyes of a man who was already gone. "Yes," he said to the reflection, his voice barely a whisper, "I will." The next 12 months were all about getting ready. Samuel started with research. The broadcast had been picked up by a deep space listening post on Europa, one of the many stations that scanned alien chatter for intel. The file leaked online within hours, slapped with warnings about graphic content. For most people who saw it, the feeling was a mix of horror and helpless anger. Samuel didn't feel any of that. He downloaded every single frame. He analyzed the landscape, the plants, the weather. He looked up the hunters in xenobiology databases and learned their name, the Verith. He studied their culture, pack hunters, obsessed with honor and the glory of the kill. He learned about the company that aired the show too, the Quiet Morning Network, a sick entertainment empire run by slug-like creatures called the Kethfari, who built their fortune on broadcasting suffering. They operated in a legal gray area, targeting species that weren't yet protected by galactic treaties. Humans were on that list. Samuel memorized their hunting schedules, their capture methods, the trafficking routes they used to bring in fresh contestants. He learned everything. Then he started working on his body. Samuel was 46 years old. He was former Army infantry, but a training accident 15 years ago had left him with a bad knee. He'd stayed in decent shape, but guiding tourists wasn't exactly combat ready. So he started running again. He swam in frozen lakes. He climbed mountains, pushing his body back to the hardened edge it once knew. His knee screamed in protest every single day, but he just ignored it. Pain was just information, and information could be managed. He started practicing with weapons again. Not guns that would set off alarms, but neve, traps, and snares. The old skills came back, first in fragments, then in a flood of muscle memory he thought he'd buried forever. He sold his cabin. He sold his truck. He sold his guiding business. 15 years of a quiet life, all turned into untraceable digital currency. With the money, he bought gear, survival equipment for hostile planets, compact tools that looked harmless, a medical kit, a water purifier, fire starters, nothing that screamed danger. Everything that would keep him alive. 11 months after Richard's death, Samuel booked a one-way trip to a place called Kepler's Reach. It was a grimy frontier colony on the edge of known space, a 3-week journey from Earth. Officially, it was a mining town. Unofficially, it was a place where people went to disappear. Samuel showed up looking like just another old, quiet guy with no one and nowhere to go. He got a cheap room near the spaceport and spent the next 2 weeks making sure everyone saw him that way, a washed-up tourist at the end of the line. He went to the right bars, the ones with bad lighting and worse company. He drank by himself, paid with cash, and just let people see him. It only took 15 days for the traffickers to take the bait. They were professionals. He had to give them that. They watched him for 3 days straight, making sure he was really alone, making sure no one would come looking for him. Samuel knew they were watching. He let them see exactly what they wanted to see, an easy target. A man who was lost and far from home, worth a lot more as cargo than as a customer. They finally made their move on a Thursday night. 3 of them, all human, local contractors for the HFY. They followed him out of the bar and into a dark alley. Before he could even pretend to react, they hit him with a neural stunner. Samuel could have taken all 3 of them down, but he didn't. He let his body go limp and let them drag him away. He let them toss him into a cargo container with 6 other people, 2 colonists who'd made the mistake of traveling alone, a family of 3 who'd been sold to pay off a debt, and a young man, not much older than Richard, who kept whispering that this was all a terrible mistake. Samuel stayed silent. The ship took off, jumping into the weird silence of hyperspace. In the dark, surrounded by the sounds of quiet crying and desperate prayers, Samuel Richmond closed his eyes and just counted the days. 14 months since he'd watched his son die, 2 weeks since he'd let them capture him. Soon the transport ship dropped out of hyperspace, and the planet Quiet Morning filled the tiny viewport. It was a swirl of green, brown, and black, with angry red scars from lava flows cutting through the jungle. It was beautiful, in a deadly kind of way. The ship shuddered as it entered the atmosphere. The other captives huddled together, their fear a thick fog in the small space. The young man who thought it was all a mistake had finally gone silent, his face a blank mask of shock. Samuel just watched the jungle get closer and closer. The ship didn't land. It just slowed to a hover over a clearing, and the cargo doors groaned open. Hot, sticky air that smelled like sulfur and decay rushed in. An artificial voice boomed through the hold. "Welcome to Quiet Morning. You have been chosen to participate in our premium entertainment experience." Imagine being told the only rule is to survive, that your life is now a game for someone else's entertainment, and your hunters will be coming for you in exactly 1 hour. What would you do? That was the reality for the captives being shoved toward the transport door. Some were too numb to even fight back. Others had to be dragged kicking and screaming. One young man, bless his heart, clung to the door frame, yelling that this couldn't be real. A guard zapped him with a neural prod, and he just tumbled into the jungle 20 feet below. But Samuel walked to the edge all on his own. He looked down and saw the others, scrambling, panicked, already disappearing into the trees. And way off in the distance, on a high ridge, he could see them, the audience. The Vareth hunters were spread out in a line, practically vibrating with excitement. Little camera drones buzzed in the air all around them, already filming every second of the horror. That's when Samuel jumped. He didn't wait to be pushed. He landed like a cat, bending his knees to absorb the shock. The heat was the first thing he noticed, a heavy blanket pressing down on him. The air was so thick with humidity it felt like breathing water. All around him, people were losing their minds, crying, praying, running blindly.
The young guy who'd fought back was still on the ground, twitching. Samuel stood up slowly. He took in the jungle, a nightmare of green and black and red, just like in the video, just like the last thing his son ever saw. He knew the Vareth were watching. He could feel their eyes on him, see the little drone swiveling to get a good shot of his face. They were waiting for him to run, to panic like all the others. Samuel didn't run. He just calmly brushed the dirt off his knees, rolled his shoulders, and took a long, deep breath of the nasty, sulfur-tinged air. Then he started walking toward the trees. Not in a hurry, just a steady, measured pace, like a man out for a morning walk who knew exactly where he was going. He could hear their alien chatter crackling from the ridge behind him. They were confused, intrigued. This was something new, something different. And for their viewers, this was going to be one heck of a show. As Samuel Richmond vanished into the jungle, he thought to himself, "I'm home." The lead hunter, Korvax, had taken 47 human lives. He was very proud of that number. All the veteran hunters kept a tally. It was like a badge of honor, a score that went up with every new season of the hunt. 47 kills over 6 years. Every single one was recorded, archived, and sold to millions of sick viewers across the network. Humans were his favorite. Some of the other hunters liked bigger game with their thick hides and dramatic death scenes. Others preferred the pack animals that were easy to trick. But Korvax, he'd developed a taste for hunting people early on and never looked back. Humans were so soft, so fragile. Their bodies broke with ease, and their minds shattered even faster. Most of them spent their last few hours on Earth sobbing, begging, or praying to gods who weren't listening.
The audience absolutely ate it up. That kind of vulnerability was a bestseller, but humans were also unpredictable, and that's what kept it interesting. They didn't follow a script. Some would just run until their hearts literally burst. Others would hide until they starved. A few would even try to fight back with rocks and sticks, which was always a good laugh. And once in a very great while, you'd get one who tried to set their own traps. Those were the hunts you never forgot. Korvax stood on the ridge, watching his latest batch of 8 humans scatter into the jungle. It was a standard hunt. The camera drones were already fanning out, making sure not to miss a single terrifying moment. Initial dispersal is complete, his tracker Vin reported from the drone control station. 7 of the targets are moving in predictable patterns. We have one anomaly. That got Korvax's attention. Anomaly? Vin pulled up a holographic screen showing a feed of an older human male just walking calmly into the dense trees, not even glancing over his shoulder. He looked like he was on a Sunday hike. "This one," Vin said, pointing. "His stress indicators are minimal, no panic response. Heart rate is up, sure, but it's controlled. He's been on the ground for 6 minutes and hasn't picked up the pace once." Korvax stared at the image. The man was definitely older than their usual prey, maybe in his mid-40s. He had a weathered face and hands that looked like they'd seen a lifetime of hard work. The way he moved through the thick jungle with such smooth and efficient motions, it screamed experience. "What's his background?" Korvax asked. Vin tapped on his data pad. "Captured on a little colony called Kepler's Reach. No military service on his record. His listed job is hunting guide, planet of origin,
Earth. A hunter. Korvax made a dry, grinding sound that was the Varith equivalent of a chuckle. "How perfect," he sneered. "At least he'll understand what's happening to him." "That's good. Fear is so much sweeter when they know what's coming." "Should we make him the priority target?" Vin asked. Korvax thought about it. The viewers expected a certain flow to the show.
You needed a few quick kills early on to get the blood pumping, then some longer chases to build suspense,
and finally, the big finale. You always save the toughest one for last. This guy could be a great finale. No, Korvax decided. Let him settle in. Let him think his little bit of experience gives him a fighting chance. We'll pick off the easy ones first and save him for day 3 or 4. By then, he'll know that his skills mean nothing here. Vin nodded and reassigned the drones. The ridge was buzzing with activity as the hunting party got ready. There were 6 of them in total, Korvax as the leader, Vin on drones, and 3 shooters named Dren, Sulk, and Matic to do the dirty work. And then there was Brennan, the rookie, who was stuck filming and carrying gear. It was a standard team, more than enough for 8 squishy humans. Korvax checked his weapons, feeling that old familiar thrill build inside him. The hunt was on. Down below, the prey was already starting to die. Samuel Richmond had been on the ground for 2 hours. In that time, he had already covered about 3 kilometers, found 4 places with drinkable water, identified 6 different types of plants he could probably eat, and located the main trail used by the planet's biggest predators. He'd also counted 18 camera drones. They flew in predictable, overlapping grids. Most of the drones were following the other captives, filming their frantic escape through the jungle. But a few had already locked onto Samuel, keeping their distance, recording his strange, calm behavior for the folks back home. He let them watch. Crouching by a stream, Samuel filled a makeshift water bottle, a giant leaf he'd folded and sealed with sticky tree sap. The water was a little warm and acidic, but it was safe. He knew he'd need a better source later, maybe from one of the volcanic springs he'd heard about, but this was fine for now. He was building a map inside his head. The jungle was thick, but it wasn't impossible to navigate. Animal trails acted like natural highways through the worst of it.
The volcanic mountains to the north created different climate zones, cooler spots near the vents with unique plants, and hotter areas where the ground could literally cook you. To the south and west was just endless flat jungle, and to the east, based on the quick look he got from the ship, was a big river cutting through a canyon. He had options, lots of them. Samuel started moving north, but not toward the high ground, not yet. He needed to scout things out first. He knew the hunters had all the advantages, better tech, more guys, and they knew this place.
But any advantage can become a weakness if you know how to use it. Take the camera drones. They were high-tech, almost silent, and could track you by your body heat. But they were also just machines following a program. They scanned the same areas at the same times, over and over, which left gaps, big gaps that a smart, patient man could use. Samuel had been watching them for 2 hours. He'd already found 3 blind spots within 1 kilometer of where he was standing. He also knew the hunters were watching him, but not too closely, not yet. They were having their fun with the easy targets first, the ones who ran and screamed and made for good TV. In the last hour, Samuel had heard 2 different screams cut short. 2 down, 6 to go, including him. He knew they'd come for him sooner or later. Once the easy kills were over and they needed something new for the show, they'd turn their full attention to the weird old guy who wouldn't run. And Samuel planned to be more than ready. An hour later, he found exactly what he was looking for. A part of the jungle where the trees were so thick they blocked out almost all the light, creating a dark maze of shadows and vines. The ground was a mess of tangled roots and hidden holes, and a huge local predator had marked this as its territory. It was perfect. And right there, in the dark, Samuel began to work.
He's just sitting there, Vin the tracker reported to Korvax. He's been there for the last hour, not moving, not making a shelter, just sitting. Korvax looked at the drone feed. Even with thermal vision, the old human was just a lump in the shadows. Maybe he's given up, said Dran, one of the shooters, as he cleaned his weapon. Some of them do that. They just go into shock and wait to die. His heart rate says he's not in shock, Vin countered. It's elevated, but it's steady. He's alert. He's just waiting. Waiting for what? Dran asked. Vin didn't have an answer. Korvax stared at the screen for a long time. They marked him as a statue, a human so terrified he'd frozen solid in the jungle. An easy kill for later. It was a mistake that would cost them everything. They didn't know this man wasn't prey. He was a predator, biding his time, and they were the ones being hunted. If you think you know how this story ends, you don't. Stick around for the next 60 seconds, and I'll show you what real justice looks like. While they ignored the still man, they focused their cameras on a different target, a kid named Eric Brandt, just 22 years old. An engineering student snatched while traveling to see his sister. He was 3 kilometers south, crying and stumbling through a swamp. Now, that was the kind of content their audience paid for. The lead hunter, Korvax, gathered his party and descended to begin the show. Wrong place, wrong time was all Eric could talk about. He'd practically fallen into Samuel's lap near a thermal vent, a spot where the warm ground could dry your clothes and the heavy smell of sulfur hid you from the hunters. The kid was a wreck, wild-eyed, desperate, and babbling the second he saw another human face. "Thank God," Eric gasped, clinging to Samuel's arm. "Oh, thank God. I thought they were all gone. I thought I was alone. We have to stick together. We gotta find a way out. My sister, she's waiting for me. She has no idea any of this happened." Samuel just listened, taking in the kid's condition. Dehydrated, exhausted, with a nasty gash on his forehead from a low-hanging branch. Eric's hands trembled, and his eyes shot nervously toward the canopy above, searching for the drones he knew were watching. He wouldn't make it through another day like this. "Please," Eric begged, his voice cracking. "You look like you know this place. You're not freaking out like everyone else was. Help me. Just help me get out of here alive." Samuel looked at the boy and saw it all. The raw fear, the sliver of hope. And in that moment, he didn't see Eric. He saw his own son, Richard. Richard, who must have felt this same terror, who must have desperately searched for someone, anyone, to help him escape this nightmare. But no one had helped Richard. And deep inside Samuel's chest, a part of him he thought had turned to stone began to crack. "What's your name?" Samuel asked, his voice raspy. "Eric Brandt." Samuel gave a slow, deliberate nod. Okay, Eric, listen to me very, very carefully. You're going to go east. In about 5 kilometers, you'll hit a river system. Follow it downstream, but do not under any circumstances walk on the open banks. Stay in the tree line. The canyon walls there should give you some cover from the cameras. He dug into his pocket and pulled out a handful of muddy roots he'd gathered. He pushed them into Eric's trembling hands. You can eat these. They're safe. And don't drink any water unless it's moving fast and looks perfectly clear. Rest when the sun is highest. Move at dawn and dusk. Their heat sensors will have a harder time locking onto you then. Eric stared at the roots as if they were solid gold. Will you come with me? Eric asked, his voice barely a whisper. Please, I don't want to be alone out here. A part of Samuel screamed to say yes, to protect this kid, to give him the chance his own son never had, to be the savior Richard never found. But he couldn't. If he went east with Eric, he would be abandoning his entire reason for being here. The hunters would go unpunished, Korvax would get away, the sick broadcast would continue, beaming the last moments of terrified humans across the galaxy for entertainment. More sons would die. Eric might live if Samuel helped him, but millions more would remain at risk. I can't, Samuel said, and the words felt like swallowing broken glass. I have something I have to finish. Something that might make sure this never happens to anyone else. Eric's face fell, but he nodded. East, Samuel repeated, gripping the young man's shoulder for a brief, firm second. Stay smart, stay quiet, and survive, Eric. That's how you win. With that, he turned and started walking north. He heard Eric call his name once, then twice, before the sounds faded as the kid headed east, clinging to the only piece of hope he had. Samuel didn't look back. He told himself the kid had a chance. The route was good, the advice was sound. But Samuel had been a hunter for 30 years. He knew the odds, and he knew that sometimes the best you can do is still not enough. As the sun went down, the hunters found Eric Brandt by the river canyon. Samuel was 2 kilometers away, perched in a tree, watching through a pair of binoculars. He was too far to see the details, but he could hear the screams. The kid lasted longer than he'd expected. 3 minutes, maybe 4. It sounded like the hunters were enjoying themselves, dragging it out for the viewers at home. Samuel could hear their cruel, barking laughter, carrying through the trees, the translated taunts, and then silence. He climbed down from the tree and got back to work. By his count, there were 4 of them left alive now, himself and 3 others scattered across this private hell. The hunters would probably pick off the others tomorrow. That gave him a little more time. The trap he was building was simple, something he used to teach tourists back in Alaska, a deadfall, a heavy log propped up and connected to a tripwire. But this version had a few personal touches. The tripwire wasn't on the ground where it could be easily spotted. It was at knee height, disguised as one of the dozens of hanging vines. The trigger was purely mechanical, so it had no electronic signature for their scanners to pick up, and he'd set it up in a natural bottleneck between 2 massive rock formations, the exact path any tracker would take following his trail north. And the log wasn't just heavy. Samuel had spent hours sharpening thick branches into deadly spikes and embedding them in its underside. When this thing fell, it wouldn't just crush. It would skewer whatever was underneath. He knew it wouldn't kill one of them outright. Their hides were too thick.
but it would wound one, pin it, and the noise would bring all the native predators that Samuel had been hearing for days. He would let the jungle finish the job. After one last check, he vanished into the shadows, climbing a tree about 50 meters away to wait. The jungle came alive with clicks, distant roars, and the constant sound of things moving in the dark. The blistering heat finally broke, but the humidity clung to him like a wet blanket. Samuel closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to enter that state of near-perfect stillness he'd mastered years ago in the army. Conserving energy, but aware of every single sound. Patience was a weapon, and Samuel was an arsenal. The trap went off at dawn. He heard it first. A sharp crack as the trigger released, a heavy thud as the log slammed down, and then a scream. A scream that wasn't human. Samuel was on his feet in an instant, moving through the shadows, silent and fast. The pale morning light cut through the mist rising from the jungle floor. He reached the trap in less than a minute. It was one of the hunters pinned under the log. He looked young. 3 of Samuel's wooden stakes had punched clean through its torso, and thick grayish-brown blood was pooling on the ground. Its spear lay a few feet away, and its communication device was sparking and broken. The hunter's eyes went wide as Samuel stepped out of the trees. It tried to speak, but only a froth of dark blood bubbled from its mouth. Samuel stood over it, his face a mask of stone. The hunter's damaged translator crackled to life. "Help! Please! I need—" Samuel knelt down, picked up the spear, looked it over, and tossed it aside. Then he went through the hunter's pack, taking water purification tablets, a small med kit, and a nasty-looking serrated knife. The kind you use for taking trophies. The hunter watched, its eyes filled with a dawning horror. "You," it gurgled. You did this! You set a trap!" Samuel finally looked at it. "My son," he said, his voice quiet and cold as the grave. "His name was Richard. You killed him last season. You turned his murder into entertainment and broadcast it to millions." The hunter's eyes widened even more. He recognized the story, and then pure terror flooded his face. No, that wasn't my hunt. I wasn't there." Samuel picked up the trophy knife. "You're all responsible," he said. "This is what you do to your prey, isn't it? Take little pieces of them, souvenirs." The hunter began to make a high, keening noise, trying to squirm away from the man who now stood over him, holding his own blade. It was a weak, pathetic sound, somewhere between a gasp and a cry. His own translator device was having a hard time making sense of it. "I'll make you a deal," Samuel said, his voice calm and steady. "Tell me everything about your hunting party, names, ranks, patrol routes, how many hunters, how many support crew, where they sleep, how they talk to each other. Give me everything, and I'll make this quick." The hunter just stared at him. "And if I don't?" Samuel's eyes drifted towards the jungle. The night predators were quieting down as dawn approached, but they were still out there. Something big was moving through the shadows, drawn in by the smell of blood. "Then I leave you here," Samuel said. "Those creatures you guys brought in to make the hunt more exciting, I've been watching them. There's a pack of them that hunts by smell about half a kilometer east of here. They'll find you in less than an hour." The hunter's breathing turned into short, wet gasps. You're insane. You're the prey. Prey doesn't do this. Prey runs and hides and then it dies. This isn't how the game is played." I'm not prey, Samuel said, his voice low. I'm a hunter, and you all made one big mistake. What mistake? Samuel leaned in close. You took the wrong human. The hunter, whose name was Brennan, talked. He was the rookie of the group, only on his second season, mostly tasked with filming for their sick documentaries, and only sometimes allowed to join in on a kill. He knew every single thing Samuel needed, the team's standard procedures, their radio frequencies, their patrol schedules, and the location of their camp near the Eastern Ridge. He also spilled that the pack leader, a guy named Korvax, had personally overseen the hunt for another human named Richard just last season. Samuel absorbed every word, memorizing each detail, asking for clarification when he needed it. When Brennan was finally done, he looked up at Samuel with a sliver of hope in his alien eyes. The deal, he rasped. You said, quick. Samuel just nodded. He got to his feet and simply walked away. Behind him, Brennan's voice erupted into a torrent of screams, curses, and desperate pleas. His translator turned it all into flat, robotic English, completely missing the raw terror in his voice. Samuel never looked back. The scavengers would be there soon. The scent of blood was already drifting through the jungle like a dinner bell for anything with sharp teeth and an empty stomach. By the time the other hunters even noticed their rookie hadn't checked in, there wouldn't be enough of him left to identify. Samuel moved silently through the jungle, heading east. He had a name now, Korvax. He had a location, the Eastern Ridge. And he had a plan. The hunters had no clue what was coming for them. Back on the observation ridge, a tracker named Ven was starting to get nervous. Brennan hasn't checked in, he reported to Korvax. His signal just vanished about 6 hours ago. His comms device might be broken. Korvax just frowned. What was his last known position? Northern sector. He was tracking that weird one, the older human who doesn't run. Send Dren to check it out, Korvax ordered. It's probably just a busted radio, but we need to be sure. Ven passed on the order, and Dren headed out, dropping down into the jungle with his high-tech spear at the ready. The audience watching from home would love this little bit of drama. A brave hunter searching for his lost comrade. Great television. Korvax turned his attention back to the main screens. 3 human prey were left. The older one, the anomaly, had disappeared somewhere in the northern jungle. 2 others were still on the move. One was heading south toward the volcanic fields, while the other was circling back to where they first landed. It was all standard, predictable, and frankly pretty boring. He really hoped the strange one would put on a better show. But on the screen, the older human was nowhere to be found. Drones swept over the area, but they saw nothing. Just empty jungle. No heat signature, no movement. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. Korvax felt a tiny flicker of unease, but he pushed it away instantly. The human was just hiding. That's all. Prey hides. It's what they do. Sooner or later he'd have to move. The cameras would spot him, and the hunt would go on just like it always did. There was nothing special about this one. Nothing at all. Dren discovered the trap site an hour after the sun came up. It was a small clearing, barely 10 meters across, boxed in by jagged volcanic rocks on 2 sides. The morning sun cut through the trees in pale beams, lighting up a scene that made absolutely no sense. The massive log from a deadfall trap was lying on the ground, stained dark with dried blood, alien blood. Dren knew the color, the smell, and the way it soaked into the dirt and turned it black. 3 sharpened stakes stuck out from the bottom of the log. 2 of them were snapped at the base, but there was no body. Dren slowly circled the area, his spear held high, his eyes scanning every shadow. The ground told him a story. There were impact marks where something heavy had hit the ground hard. There were drag marks leading off toward the trees on the east side, and there were scattered pieces of equipment and tracks, not alien tracks, but something else. A lot of somethings moving like a pack coming toward this spot from all directions. Scavengers, the jungle's cleanup crew, drawn in by the smell of blood and an easy meal. They had gotten to Brennan long before anyone else did. Dren switched on his comms device. "Pack leader, I've found this site." Korvax's voice crackled back. "Report." It was a trap, a deadfall with stakes inside. Brennan must have set it off. There's blood everywhere, but no body. The scavengers got him. There was a long silence on the other end. "A trap," Korvax repeated, his voice flat. "You're telling me Brennan walked into a trap?" "That's what it looks like." Brennan was a trained hunter. He knew this jungle. He wouldn't just stumble into a trap set by prey. Dren looked again at the sharpened stakes, at the carefully hidden tripwire, at how the kill zone was perfectly placed right where a tracker would walk. "This wasn't some sloppy trap made in a panic," he said slowly. "This was built by someone who knew exactly what they were doing." Another pause, even longer this time. "Get back to base. We'll talk about this here." The communication ended. Dren took one last look around the trap site. The blood, the drag marks, the stakes that had been carved with such patient, deadly skill. A cold feeling settled deep in his gut. He turned and started heading back to the ridge. He never made it. Samuel had been shadowing Dren for 2 hours. It wasn't that hard. The alien hunter moved like he owned the place, sticking to the main trails, glancing at his scanner now and then. He was good, a total professional, but he was looking for prey. For someone running, panicking, hiding. He wasn't looking for another predator. Samuel stayed about 50 meters behind him, using the landscape to stay hidden. The jungle offered plenty of cover. Fallen logs, rocky hills, and thick bushes that muffled every sound. He moved when Dren moved, froze when Dren froze, matching his pace perfectly. It was all about patience. The aliens had all the fancy tech, sensors, scanners, radios that could call for backup in an instant. A head-on fight was too risky. Samuel had to get close without being seen. He had to strike before Dren even knew he was there. He just needed the perfect moment, and then it came. Dren stopped at the edge of a stream to check his scanner and confirm his route back to camp. The stream was shallow but flowed fast, fed by hot springs somewhere up the mountain. The sound of the rushing water would cover any small noises. The rocky banks blocked the view, and Dren had to look down to watch his step. That's when Samuel made his move. 30 meters, 20, 10. Dren was now ankle-deep in the water, carefully stepping on the slippery rocks. His focus split between his footing and his scanner. 5 meters. Samuel pulled out the knife he'd taken. Dren heard something at the last second and started to turn, his hand reaching for his spear, but he was way too slow. Samuel hit him from behind. He wrapped one arm around the alien's throat and drove the knife up under its jaw, right where the tough skin was thinnest. The blade sliced through flesh and muscle, hitting something vital. A spray of gray-brown blood splattered across the rocks. Dren tried to scream, but only a wet gurgling sound came out.
Samuel held on, squeezing tighter, feeling the alien's struggles get weaker and weaker until they stopped completely. It took maybe 3 seconds, 4 at most, and then there was nothing. Samuel gently lowered the body into the stream. The current immediately started pulling at it, carrying the dark blood away in long ribbons. He worked fast, like a machine. He took the spear, the scanner, and the communication device which he crushed under his boot. Then he dragged the body onto the bank and got to work. The predators in this jungle left very specific marks. Samuel had spent the last 2 days studying them, looking at their kill sites, figuring out their attack patterns. The claw marks were always at certain angles. The bite marks had a unique spacing. A good tracker could look at a kill and know exactly what animal did it. So Samuel created a signature. He used the knife to carve new wounds into the body that perfectly matched the local apex predator. He ripped the clothing in just the right spots, scattered the gear around to make it look like there was a struggle, and then dragged the body into a shallow ditch near the stream, leaving it just like a predator would leave a half-eaten meal. It wouldn't hold up to a real forensic investigation, but it would probably be enough to fool a bunch of arrogant hunters who desperately wanted to believe they were still in charge. Samuel washed the knife in the stream and then vanished back into the jungle. Hey there, space human. I'm super curious to know what you thought of this part of the story. Go ahead and drop a quick comment below to let me know what's on your mind, or just say hi if you'd like. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Also, don't forget to check out the pinned comment. Trust me, you'll want to see it. Oh, and one last thing. I've picked out another awesome video just for you. Just click the card right here, or over here if you want to binge the whole playlist. I'll see you there.